pen was government issue. She noticed that first. Before anything else, before the fluorescent light humming 2 feet above her head, before the clerk who hadn't looked up since she sat down, before the stack of forms that spelled out, in official language, the administrative fact of her own death. She noticed the pen, black plastic, the kind that comes in boxes of 50, the kind that gets clipped to clipboards in supply rooms in places she'd rather not think about. She held it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she filled in the date. The form had a field for it, right there between next of kin and branch of service. Date of death. She wrote in the numbers the Army had assigned to her, the date they'd closed her file, flagged her ID, and added her name to the list that nobody wants to be on. She wrote it the way you write a birth date or a social security number, without ceremony. Then she moved on to the next line. The clerk took the forms without reading them, stamped something, said someone would be in touch. She said, "Copy that," and walked back out into the Texas afternoon. The drive to her mother's house took 40 minutes. She knew every mile of it, the overpass where the paint had been peeling since 2009, the feed store with the sign that had been missing its second letter for as long as she could remember, the stretch of highway where the heat made everything on the horizon look like it was dissolving. She'd driven this road in her head 1,000 times in the dark, in places that had no roads, no horizon, nothing she was allowed to think about too precisely even now. The neighborhood smelled the way it always had, mesquite and someone else's dinner, and the specific dry warmth that the desert holds in its throat until late October. Her mother's house had a new door. She stood on the porch and looked at it for a moment before she knocked. The old door had been brown, the kind of brown that happens to wood when nobody picks the color intentionally. This one was dark green. Someone had made a decision at some point, gone to a hardware store, stood in front of a rack of paint samples and chosen something. She knocked. She waited. The door opened, and her mother was there, and for a moment neither of them moved. Her mother's hand was still on the doorknob, and her face was doing something that didn't have a name, something that wasn't surprise because it was too large for surprise, and wasn't relief because it was too complicated for relief, and wasn't grief because grief was what had been here before, and this was something that had arrived to replace it. Her mother sat down on the porch step, not dramatically, not with her hands over her face or anything that could be described in a way that would seem adequate later. She just sat down, the way a person sits down when their legs have made a decision without consulting anyone, and she sat there on the concrete in her house shoes, and that was all. She sat down next to her. They didn't say anything for a while. A dog barked 2 houses down. A car passed. The sky did what the sky does in West Texas in the afternoon, which is turn a particular shade of orange that doesn't exist anywhere else and doesn't apologize for it. After some time her mother said, "I made rice." She said, "Okay." They went inside. The Army began the process of unkilling her the following Monday. This was not a fast process. There was, it turned out, a great deal of paperwork involved in being officially alive again, and the paperwork was spread across multiple departments that did not communicate with each other as efficiently as a person might hope. Her pay records had been transferred to a closed account. Her clearance had been suspended pending a review process that nobody could fully explain, but everyone agreed was necessary. Her previous bunk had been assigned to a specialist named Gutierrez, who had been there for 8 months, and had pictures on the wall and a coffee maker on the shelf, and looked at her with the specific helpless guilt of someone who has done nothing wrong but still feels responsible. She told Gutierrez to keep the coffee maker. She didn't need it. The specialist who handled her reinstatement was named Henderson. He was young in the way that made her feel she had aged significantly in a short amount of time, and he had the careful, apologetic energy of someone who has read the file and doesn't know which of the things in it he is allowed to mention. He explained, with genuine and slightly pained courtesy, that her previous ID could not be reactivated because it had been flagged as belonging to a deceased individual, and the system didn't have a procedure for unflagging it, so they would need to issue her a new one, which would require a new photo, which meant going to the 3rd building on the left and asking for a woman named Corporal Reyes. Already handled, she told him. She had gone to Corporal Reyes first thing that morning, before Henderson had finished his coffee. Henderson looked down at his form. He looked back up. He appeared to be trying to decide whether to say something. "Don't," she said. He didn't. Her unit's common room was at the end of the main corridor, past the water fountain that had been slightly too cold since at least 2017, and the bulletin board with the same safety reminder that had been there so long it had become part of the wall. She walked past all of it without looking, because she had walked this corridor in her head so many times that looking at it felt like checking that the memory was accurate, and she didn't especially want to know if it wasn't. The common room door was open. She stopped in the doorway. The plaque was on the far wall, between the unit crest and a photograph from a deployment 3 years ago. It was the standard kind, dark wood border, brass plate, the kind they make in batches. Her name was on it, her rank, the dates, the small engraved line at the bottom that says what they all say, the phrase that gets used so often it has nearly stopped meaning anything, and then suddenly, in a specific moment, means everything. Below the plaque, on the table, there was a coffee ring. Someone had set a mug there that morning. The ring was still damp at the edges. The world had been moving in this room every day she was gone. People sitting at that table, setting down their coffee, getting up again, living their days in the ordinary way that people live their days when they are not required to think about the people who aren't there anymore. She stood in the doorway and looked at her name on the wall. She looked at the coffee ring. Then anger moved through her, and it was sweet in the way that familiar things are sweet, and she was grateful for it, because she knew what to do with anger. Anger was a tool she understood. It fit in the hand correctly. It gave her somewhere to put her weight. She turned and walked back down the corridor. The water fountain was still too cold. Her sergeant major's name was Trevino, and he had been doing this job for 22 years, and in 22 years he had dealt with a number of situations that required a person to remain steady when everything around them was shifting. He was, by any measure, a steady man. He'd had the notification delivered to her mother himself, because he'd believed it was his responsibility and not something to be handled by a stranger. He'd sat in the family assistant's office and answered questions he didn't have full answers to. He'd done all of it the way he did everything, without drama, without looking away. He was at his desk when she walked into his office. He looked up. He stood up. He sat back down. He stood up again. She had never seen him do that before. In 11 years, she had never seen that man unsure of whether to stand or sit. She filed it away without comment. "Vasquez," he said. "Sergeant Major," she said. That was all either of them had for a moment. The room held it. Outside the window a formation was running past, someone calling cadence, the sound moving and then fading the way sound does when the source keeps moving and you stay still. He said, "You look like hell." "Working on it," she said. He sat back down fully, and she sat in the chair across from him, and they talked for an hour and a half about the things that needed to be handled, the administrative things, the official things, the sequence of events that had to occur in a specific order before she could exist on paper the way she existed in the room. They did not talk about the other things. Those were not on the agenda, and neither of them put them there, and that was fine. That was how she needed it to be. When she stood up to leave, he said, without looking up from his desk, "Glad you're back, Sergeant." She stopped at the door. "That's on me," she said. She wasn't sure what she meant by it exactly, but it felt true. She found out about the ceremony from a private named Okafor, who had the look of someone who has just realized they have said the wrong thing, and is hoping no one noticed. Okafor had mentioned it in passing, in the way people mention things they assume you already know, and then had gone very still in the way that people go still when they understand that you did not, in fact, already know. There had been a memorial service, 4 months ago, the whole unit. The chaplain had spoken. There had been a photograph, the one from her deployment, the one she hadn't known anyone kept. People had said things about her, real things apparently, not the polished official things but the actual things, the kind that only get said when the person isn't in the room to hear them. She thought about that for a while, people standing in a room, saying the true things about her, while she was somewhere else entirely. She told Okafor it was fine. Okafor looked like they did not believe her, which was fair, because she was not entirely sure she believed herself, but she meant it in the way she meant most things she said, not as a complete truth, but as the direction she intended to move. There was a conversation, later, with someone from a department whose name she kept forgetting, about what had happened. She answered the questions she was cleared to answer and did not answer the others, and the person across the table wrote things down and didn't press, and eventually the conversation ended the way those conversations end, with paperwork and a handshake and the quiet mutual agreement to leave certain doors closed. What she didn't say, in that conversation or any other, was that the hardest part had not been the worst of it. The hardest part had been the ordinary things, the things that had no drama in them, no weight you could name or point to. Lying still in a place that was wrong in every way a place can be wrong, and thinking about the overpass with the peeling paint, the feed store sign, the specific smell of her mother's kitchen at 6 in the evening when dinner was almost ready and the light came through the window at that particular angle. She had kept those things the way you keep matches in a wet place, carefully, with both hands, knowing that the moment you stop being careful, they're gone. She had not stopped being careful. The uniform they issued her was new. Her old one had been processed out with her belongings months ago, distributed or stored or misplaced in the way that things get misplaced in large organizations that were not expecting to need them again. The new one was stiff in the shoulders. It would soften. She had broken in enough uniforms to know it would soften. She put it on at 05:30 on a Tuesday and stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom of the temporary quarters they'd assigned her. And she looked at herself for a moment the way she had not looked at herself in a long time. The rank on her collar, her name on her chest, the same name on the plaque in the common room down the corridor. She was 41 years old and she was standing in a bathroom in Texas, and she was alive, and the plaque was still up, and nobody had taken it down yet, and she passed it every morning on the way to formation. She didn't look at it, but she knew exactly where it was, the height of it, the color of the wood, the weight of her name in brass on the wall of a room that had learned how to exist without her in it. She laced her boots. She went to formation. Someone asked her once, not long after, what it was like, coming back. They asked it the way people ask questions they're not sure they should be asking, with a carefulness around the edges, watching her face for the signal to stop. She didn't give them the signal. She let them finish the question. She thought about the green door her mother had chosen while she was gone, the coffee ring under her name on the wall, the way Trevino had stood up and sat down and stood up again, and how that small, unsteady moment had been the truest thing anyone had offered her since she walked back through the gate. She thought about Henderson and his careful apologies, and Gutierrez and the borrowed coffee maker, and the water fountain that was still too cold, and Okafor's face when they realized what they'd said. She thought about her mother sitting down on the concrete in her house shoes without deciding to. "Fine," she said. Which was true. The way the word fine is always carrying more than it looks like it's carrying. The way a person can mean something real with a word that sounds like nothing. The way you can be standing in the middle of the rest of your life and not have language yet for the size of it. Fine. The plaque was still on the wall. She still passed it every morning. She still didn't look at it. And every morning, without deciding to, she knew it was there.